Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host and I'm your moderator. I'm also the creator of thechocolatelife.com. Today, we're going to be talking about a bit of legislation that is forthcoming in the EU that is going to have just really, really profound effects on the world of chocolate over the course of the next couple of years. My guest today is Antonie Fountain, who is the director of the Voice Network, or the executive director of the Voice Network. Antonie, welcome to the episode today.
Thanks for having me, Clay.
And you are calling in from where?
I'm based in the Netherlands, so different continent than yourself.
Well, and for people who know about chocolate, they know that the Netherlands is the largest center for cocoa processing and has this amazing history and connection going back hundreds and hundreds of years into the world of cocoa and chocolate. So I think it's very important that we're having this cross-Atlantic conversation today because chocolate is in fact a global product. So we're going to be diving deep into what the EUDR, the European Deforestation Regulation, means. And for those who may not know, Antonie and the Voice Network have been involved in this activity for something like 5 years now, I think you said?
Approximately, yes.
All right. So a great resource on this. So what I want to do is remind everybody that you can go into the comments, whether you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and on YouTube it's the live chat, and you can make a comment or ask a question about anything that Antonie and I talk about today. And with that, Antonie, so number one, what is the focus of the EUDR, right? So what is the goal? When we think about the legislative framework, what is it that EUDR is all about?
The title of the EUDR actually is quite self-explanatory in this context. It's the European Union's Deforestation Regulation. So it's really aimed at stopping deforestation. Now, it's actually one of three pieces of regulation that the European Union is working on at the moment. It's the first one that's finished, but there are two others in the pipeline. There's a corporate sustainability due diligence directive as well, which is looking at a broader set of human rights and environmental due diligence requirements that companies need to start taking. And we might spend some time in today's podcast to talk about the difference between a due diligence approach and what is in the EUDR. And then the last one is on forced labor, which will also obviously be quite interesting to the cocoa sector as well. So there's these three big legislations that are coming through the European Union's pipeline. And this first one is really aimed at stopping deforestation. And so what it does is it basically requires any cocoa, and actually of quite a few other products that will be coming into the European Union after December of 2024, to basically be able to prove that it's not come from areas that have been deforested after 2020. So it's an import ban on deforested commodities, basically.
Great. So what I want to do is I want to share a bit of information that I found with you, which is from a coffee market study. Now, this coffee market, so regular watchers of the Pod Save Chocolate will know that I produce a post for every single episode, and this is the post for this one. And there is a set of resources and links that you can go to. So you don't have to pay attention to links here. What you can do is you can go and take a look at them after the fact. But there's an interesting point that was made in this coffee market study that I've said is that it says that when it comes to the 10 million hectares of forest lost worldwide each year, 90% of that is caused by agricultural development, right? And when we look at that for the European Union, I'm assuming this is products which is imported into the EU, oil palm accounts for roughly a third of the deforestation, soy for another third of the deforestation, timber, cocoa, and coffee less than 10% of the deforestation that goes on. And so if we look at that sort of distribution of things, how do I, as a chocolate maker, take a look at it? Because I'm going to assume, right, that I need to be worried about my cocoa, whatever that is. But for example, if I'm using a wood-based, a timber-based paper,
Mm-hmm.
then I need to worry about its sourcing potentially, right? And if I'm
Yep.
using maybe lecithin, soy-based lecithin, I need to worry about the sourcing of the soy. Um,
Yep.
if I'm doing a milk chocolate, there could be some, maybe. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the answer to that question. Um, but it's and I suppose that if I'm an industrial chocolate maker, not only do I need to worry about my cocoa, but if I'm using cocoa butter equivalent, which is based on fractionated palm oil, then
Mm-hmm.
this becomes really, really, really complicated. So because you and I are probably best known for our work in the world of craft chocolate or specialty cocoa and specialty chocolate. What are the most important things that the specialty chocolate maker, the craft chocolate maker, needs to know about sourcing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that they can make sure that they are in compliance. It's a lot of explanation
Yep.
for a very, very complicated question.
Well, I think it is complicated for the simple reason is that for the last decades, the EU and basically every other country has just gone completely laissez-faire where it came to where your products come from. So it's like we've never cared about this before. It's always been on the basis of voluntary willingness to do something about this. And this is a real paradigm shift about how companies can do business. It's no longer something that's optional, it's becoming mandatory. So you're going to have to do it, right? And yeah, that is a big change. I think in about 5, 10, 15 years, we'll look back and we'll say, I can't believe that we used to think this was normal, right? To not look at this. And I think it'll be like when I started working about 20, 25 years ago here in the Netherlands, it was normal for people to still smoke behind their desks in offices, right? Nowadays, it's considered absolutely anathema. And I think that this is going to be something like that. But for the first few years, when they put in place this smoking ban in offices in the Netherlands, especially the smokers were furious that they were, their rights were being infringed upon, et cetera, et cetera. And nowadays, nobody in their right mind would consider it normal to sit behind your office and to light up a cigarette, right? So I think that's kind of the paradigm shift we're working towards. But what does this mean concretely for companies? Well, it means that you can't claim ignorance anymore. And that means that the structures are going to have to be set up that prove that your product is not coming from a deforested piece of land, regardless of what product it is. And there's a whole list of products that are on that commodity list.
Let me jump in there and talk about,
Mhm.
so who is responsible for determining whether land is or is not deforested as of 2020? Because this is a real
Mhm.
challenge, right? Number
Mhm.
one is because you know you know you know is satellite mapping accurate enough? I mean, if the EU is doing this work and providing
Mhm.
satellite maps, or can I rely on those
Mhm.
maps, or does every individual country or every individual farmer
Mhm.
need to come up with their own maps? And who decide whose maps are the correct ones?
I think that a lot of those technicalities are going to be solved over time, and we'll find ways that work better than others. I don't think everybody's going to have to come up with their own way to work, because I don't think that that's a workable solution, because there's just too many farmers out there, right?
Right.
But in
And
the end, the
are the
person
farmers gonna can the farmers pay? I mean, number one.
that's a really big question, and I think we'll get to that later when we're asking kind of how is this being designed around, how will this impact farmers? But let's first answer the question. So who's responsible for compliance here? And the law says basically it's whoever is placing the product on the European market. Now, it's important to note.
Oh no. So Anthony, you have right. So Anthony, if you can hear me, can you go into the private chat?
I can hear you.
You're back. You're back.
I'm
You
back.
froze you're back.
I was
You
gone
froze
for
for
a
a couple.
second there, but I think I'm back.
Yep.
Apologies for that. Um, so,
So we were talking about whoever's responsible for placing the product
yeah,
in the
whoever's
European market, and
responsible
that's
for
when it
placing
froze.
Exactly. And that's important for chocolate makers to know, because it's not just about the cocoa beans, it's for every cocoa derived product, right? So you can't kind of then through, like, let's say, oh, but I've manufactured it in the States, so because it's manufactured in the States, I can export to Europe. It won't work that way. So any product that has cocoa in it, whether it's manufactured in the US, in Colombia, in Europe, in West Africa, doesn't matter. They're going to have to be able to prove. And so we're going to have to develop systems that have a traceability component. And that goes beyond just the satellite imagery, right? Because you can take a photograph of a farm, but that doesn't mean that the beans that are in this bag actually come from the photographed farm. So you're going to have a credible traceability system and not just a satellite mapping ability, right? So people that are much smarter at this than I am are developing systems to do this. And I actually think that modern technology allows for a lot more possibilities than we used to have. Like, for example, blockchain, etc. I know that that's a term that so many people use that it's boring to a point of being cliche, but I think that that kind of technology where there's like a built-in sense of assurance, items like that can start helping in this. And in fact, 15, 20 years ago, I think Armajaro, they already had a very functioning traceability system using kind of hard copy barcodes that they had like this tear off strip on every bag of cocoa, and you just tear off the barcode, put it in a bucket, and every time it got transferred, another barcode got torn off, and you could just follow that barcode from beginning to end. So you don't per se need all the digital technology to make this happen. And pre-mobile phones, this was possible already, right? So I don't think the problem is too much in the technical aspect. I think the problems are much more around how can you make it credible and how can you make it affordable. I think those are the two big questions going
So
forward.
I want to talk really quickly about the credibility issue, specifically around the overuse of the word blockchain. And this is a personal opinion, and is shared by many people that I know. But blockchain is about assuring the integrity of the data once it gets entered into the system. So once the data are in the blockchain, we can see if anybody has tried to tamper with it. However, blockchain doesn't talk about the veracity of the data. And it's this veracity of the data that we need to think about first. So can we trust the person who is providing the data to us to be able to provide complete, accurate data for what's going on, right? And so for people who say, blockchain is the answer, no, blockchain is a part of a solution, but it is not necessarily the holy grail. And so I get really frustrated when people talk about that. And so I agree with you. I mean, if you're going to get to the least common denominator, which is what can an individual smallholder cocoa farmer do, you can't be reliant on a smartphone, right, which has got a guaranteed connection to the internet, right, in order to be able to do this, because it's probably going to fail and disadvantage some set of farmers. That's a completely other issue for which we could spend weeks and weeks and months about it.
But it does touch on a key question, which is like, how reliable is the data going to be, and how are farmers going to be supported? Now, on the point of reliability, there's some real issues there that I think you're going to have to deal with any which way you're going to be talking about, whether it's deforestation free, whether it's child labor free, whether farmers are earning sufficient income, et cetera, et cetera. The veracity and the integrity of data at the beginning is always going to be an issue. One of the ways that you can start working on workarounds there is if you require regular input, like on an annual or a season by season basis, at some point you start building up data sets where you can actually then pick out anomalies over time. And so for me, a lot of these issues, when I look at them, I think you've got kind of single point data point problems, but they become much less prevalent when it actually becomes part of a collection of data points over seasons and years. And so I think that some of these questions will become less problematic over time, because we can actually start picking out the inconsistencies. We say, hey, buddy, in your system last year, you had 1,500 kilos, but this year, all of a sudden, you've got 5,500 kilos coming from the same plot of land. What's up? Right. And I think that that's the kind of integrity that we're going to. And so for me, looking at this regulation, I'm looking at this more from a medium to long-term lens. Most of the problems that are coming up are short-term and real problems for the short term, but almost all of them are solvable or become non-issues over the medium to long term. So on the medium to long term, I'm really optimistic about this regulation. I think the challenges are in kind of this big transition and this disruption that we're going through at the moment.
So how many years does this transition occupy? Right. So that was a rhetorical question. I mean, it is
5 to 15 years is my non-rhetorical answer.
And I would agree with you that, and I'm going to be cynical, and it's going to be on the longer side. So let's talk about, so when we talk about placing product in the European market, because this is really, really important.
Yep.
Is it the exporter of the product, or is it the importer of the product, or is it the person who is responsible for actually selling the product, who is the person who places the product on the market? So is it a little importer like High Five Chocolate, Dennis Van Essen, right, whom we all know? But if Dennis sells it to a retailer, let's say Carrefour or somebody like that, is it Carrefour who is responsible for placing it on the market?
Basically, it's whoever imports it. If you're the one bringing it across the border, that's the person that's going to be responsible, or the company responsible for compliancy. So whoever is bringing it across the border, whoever is bringing it into the EU. However, the people then further down need to be able to trust that whoever brought it in is compliant. So there are obviously, you still need to do your due diligence when you're further down the supply chain. You need to be asking the question. But
And so I'm going to assume when we see the person who's bringing it across the border, it is the recipient on the bill of lading, not the company that's providing the transportation.
I'm not a trade lawyer. That's a good question to ask someone that has more knowledge on this on trade law than I do. Yeah.
So I'm actually going to have a conversation on Thursday morning with the EC trade representative in Nigeria about this, because I'm getting ready for the Nigerian version of the International Cocoa and Chocolate Forum. And so we're going to be doing an interview on this concept. And that is a question that I'm going to ask. But I get the sense, before I jump into my first question here, I get the sense that the EU is aware that there are a lot of unknown unknowns. And so there is going to be a period during which, and is it going to be the first 3 of this 5 to 15 years? There's going to be a period in which they are going to recognize, this is bad behavior. You need to correct it, so you're on notice that you're out of compliance. But we're not necessarily going to start fining you right away. I mean, is that because
that's an optimistic reading of how the EU is planning to operate?
Please tell me more.
So the EU is like incredibly rules-based, and the rules are quite stringent here. And so a lot of the people involved in these commodities, people that are very much pro this regulation, like myself, are looking at this December 2024 deadline with some concern around kind of, are we going to be able to ease into this? Is there going to be a transition phase? Is there going to be some leniency? Part of this will be dependent on, because the EU is not like a big monolith. If you look at how many civil servants work for the European Union, there's like 50,000. There are actually more civil servants that work for the municipality of Paris, than there are actually civil servants that work for the EU itself. And so the EU kind of divests a lot of the execution of their plans to national authorities. And so in this case, a lot of this is also going to come down to how our port authority is going to interpret the rulings in various countries. And I think you'll find that some countries tend to be a bit more stickler to rules than other countries. And so my expectation is the Dutch will probably be like really strict. The Belgians will be quite lenient, as will the Spanish. The Germans will be unpredictable in this. So it kind of depends how that goes. But the thing is that anybody in the EU could sue their port authority if they're not doing the proper job according to the law. And so that's where things become complex. We don't really know how it's going to be interpreted yet. So there's unclarity here. But somewhere this could be the only way it gets done, because we're doing something new for the very first time, right? This is something that hasn't been done before. So what would have been nice is a little bit of leniency, and DG Environment, which is the ministry, so to speak, the department within the European Commission that's been responsible for setting this up, has not been incredibly receptive to the questions around, hey, like, let's make sure we can land this thing immediately. And that's partly because industry, and not the cocoa industry, actually, to be fair here, but generally speaking, industry that has been pushing back on this has been doing so because they didn't want to. They've been like 5-year-olds screaming in the candy aisle that they demand bubblegum, right? And so the cocoa industry actually being a very strong exception here. They've been one of the big proponents of this regulation, but also they're looking at the Commission at the moment saying, please be more clear about how and what we can do, and please also provide more support, particularly to the communities and the farmers that need to be compliant. Because what this regulation has done is been very clear about compliancy, but it has been completely unclear about who has to cover the cost for compliance. So when you're like really clear about compliancy, but then completely agnostic about power, then of course the people without power are going to be the ones that are going to have to bear the costs.
And we talked about that just as we were getting ready for this. And then I'm going to go to the first question, which is that the EUDR, as you said, is about protecting forests. It's not about protecting farmers. And so when we look at this power imbalance, this inequity, one of the potential drawbacks of the regulation is that the farmers who are already at disadvantage are going to be disadvantaged again.
Yeah.
Right? So they're going to require probably their federal governments, right, to be able to be strong advocates for them in this regulation. So, for example, I'm just guessing because individual. So one of the challenges with being an individual smallholder farmer is that you actually have no political power, you have no economic leverage, you have none, and it's basically accept it or don't. Right. So either sell us your cocoa or don't sell us your cocoa. In the end, we really don't care about your 500 kilos, right? So that is an aspect of this inequity. Whereas we don't have a bunch of smallholder palm oil growers. We don't have a bunch of smallholder soybean farmers, right? That's not the way things work. But what I want to do is I want to get to the first question. This is from Leo Vogel, who's watching on YouTube. Leo, so is the cutoff period of December 2020 also considered a challenge, given that some suppliers who contributed deforestation prior to 2020 have now become compliant?
So basically, it's not got to do with the supplier. It's got to do with the plot of land where the product is coming from. So if that cocoa is coming from land where the trees have been cut down in the last 3 years, then there's no way you're going to get to market in the EU. I think that's going to be quite clear. And the further we move along, like in 5 and 10 and 15 years, that cutoff date is going to be further and further in the past, right? But kind of in its first inception time, there will be feelings, oh, is this right? Is this not right? Now, there's been a lot of people out there that says that December 2020 was far too late. Anyway, we should have gone for 2014 or 2010 or 2018. There's been a lot of negotiations and outrage around which date you get. The date's been chosen. That date will not move. Again, that will not move. That's the EU does not change these kind of requirements. So, and we've got some pretty decent satellite maps from before 2020 and some decent satellite maps after 2020. And satellite mapping is actually quite capable of finding the different kinds of canopies that are there, especially over the past couple of years. So basically 2020 is close enough to now that technology was good enough to be able to basically map what was there, and whether that's a LiDAR or a different kind of mapping, kind of the resolution has become so fine-grained, like 50 centimeters as the resolution of the imagery, that it's definitely not a technological challenge. And from a political point of view, the EU, there's no way in hell they're going to change that date.
So, okay, so the idea being is that the land may have been deforested prior to 2020, right? And so there is an open question as to, so it's you still can't pull product from that land, right? If it was deforested prior to 2020, but there's no way in hell, I think is the phrase you use.
Yeah.
That if there was a change from 2019 to 2020 and it was deforested in 2020 as opposed to 2019, it's not going to make it. So, where is how does that boundary condition get handled?
Well, basically it's going to be a very binary yes, no.
Okay.
They're not, so like it's December 2020. So yeah, but we cut down these trees in January of 2021. Like, yeah, buddy, you're not coming in here anymore.
Okay.
It is going to be that simple.
Right. But if it was December of 2019,
that's within the cutoff date. So you're fine.
Okay. So we need to be more concerned about lands that have been deforested in the last, right now, 3 years. Okay. So
yes.
So that actually reduces.
And let's be very clear. Any cocoa that is coming from land that is being deforested in the last 3 years, we have known for quite a while now that deforestation as a driver, cocoa as a driver for deforestation, is something that we need to do something about. All of the big cocoa companies have promised back in 2017 to stop doing it immediately. The big cocoa producing nations have committed to traceability systems that were going to be in place by 2018, etc. So 2020 is already a grace period. So if you've been involved in cutting down original old growth rainforest to grow cocoa in the last 3 years, then I am sorry, but you've basically created your own bed that you need to sleep in.
So I want to talk about specifically. I mean, I was speaking with Terry Collingsworth on Friday about the new lawsuit they filed against Mars Mondelez and Cargill as a result of the CBS News investigation. Right. And one of the things, if we look, for example, at the Alien Tort Statute, which went up to the Supreme Court, and then the case which is in the DC federal court at the moment, which is using the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that one of the things that the companies who are named defendants in the lawsuits have been saying all this time is that this was arm's length. We didn't know about it. Right? And so when it comes to deforestation, they could say, well, if an individual smallholder farmer wants to go and cut down, another hectare of land, it's an arm's length relationship. We didn't cause the farmer to do that. Right? That's a little bit different from a palm oil where I've got, where it is big corporations doing it, or soybeans where I might have 100,000 hectare monoculture. There's one in Brazil, which I think is that size. In which case it is the company that is in fact responsible. That one of the things that the CBS News investigation said is, no, these relationships are not arm's length. You do know about them, right? And you're aware of them. But one of the things I think that the EUDR is saying is that we don't care, right? We don't care that you were the mover of the reason for the reason why the forest was cut down. It's you're buying product which is cut from deforested lands.
If the regulation would say, hey, look, indeed, it's at arm's length, so this doesn't pertain to you, you create this massive unintended negative consequence of just making every commodity indirect so that you can feign ignorance, right? So I think kind of trying to avoid that, it's been very good that they've done it this way. Also because I was in Cote d'Ivoire a couple of weeks ago talking to a cocoa farmer, and he said, basically, we are employees of these big companies. We just don't have any of the rights of the employees. So
it sounds like the relationship that Uber and Lyft have with their drivers.
It's not very different. It's really not very different. Smallholders are only entrepreneurs in a strictly legal sense of the word. They are not their own bosses. They do not dictate the terms on which they operate.
So let's talk about one of the things that let's get into. So we talked about the purpose of the EUDR, but before I do that, number one, I want to ask Leo, if he's still watching, if we answered his question for them, just number one. But number two is I want to say we're about halfway through. Quick reset. If you're watching Pod Save Chocolate, my name is Clay Gordon. My guest today, Antonie Fountain of Voice Network, and we're talking about the EU Deforestation Regulation, not just within the context of cocoa, but what it means more broadly. And we're going to spend, I think, a lot of the next remaining time to us talking about what this means for cocoa farmers and small chocolate makers. I think that's a really, really important way to go. But I want to remind everybody that every episode of Pod Save Chocolate is, in fact, sponsored by members of the Chocolate Life. So here we are with the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. You can go there and you can click on the account button. It will say join if you're not logged in, and support the work that we're doing here. If you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, hit all the bells. That would be really, really, really appreciated to grow the community here and to share what it is that we're doing. For every single episode of Pod Save Chocolate, there is a post. You can go and you can see all of those, and as well as links to resources which I collected and in this case corroborated with Antonie before the beginning. There's a lot of information in here if you want to know about the backstory and everything like that, as well. And and if we mention anything in specific during the course of the episode, we'll add it. I will add it to the list after the episode. So I want to thank everybody who's watching and is going to continue to watch all the way through the end. So one of the questions that so I had a chance to talk with Mark Donaldson. You know Mark?
No, I can't say
So
I do.
Mark used to be the chairman of the Cocoa Association of Asia. I think he's the past chairman, right? And he's now in France. And I reached out to him because of his position in the Cocoa Association. And one of the things that he and I discussed, and this was maybe 2 weeks ago, was that at the time there was a lack of clarity about which is going to affect a lot of issues, which is that if a cocoa product, so if cocoa beans, derivatives, or chocolate product were in the EU on December 31st, 2024, right, would they be exempt from the regulations, or would they immediately become cocoa non grata? Persona non grata? What is the cocoa equivalent? Anyway, on January 1st, 2025. Right?
Yeah. That had a lot of people concerned for a while, but apparently last week the Commission released a new set of frequently asked questions around implementation, and apparently they've said, no, that's a transition that we can waive the responsibility there. So I think the cocoa, and kind of technically speaking, the legislation on the EUDR is already in force because it pertains to all commodities on the list that have been harvested since June of this year. Right. But the import ban doesn't come into force until December of next year. And so kind of there's this like 18-month period from harvest to import. So it would be cocoa that is then already harvested, but not imported to Europe yet. So that apparently there's going to be some exemptions there, et cetera. So, So to me, a lot of these questions really are about kind of these initial startup hiccups, right? Kind of how are we going to get across the first bump of December next year? And I think the biggest questions there shouldn't be around the technicalities of what do we do with these tonnages. I think a big question is, for example, so we're starting to see industries, I haven't seen the data for cocoa yet, but for example, in the coffee sector, we're starting to see traders starting to look towards larger origins like Vietnam that can provide more compliancy to this law and moving away from smallholder farmers in East Africa, right? Now, this kind of disengagement in order to comply is something that we're very concerned about. And we actually think that there should be measures in place that don't allow companies to do that. Now, that legally speaking is really hard to do, because how do you stop someone from changing their sourcing if they're sourcing from the commodities markets, right? So those are some real issues. I think in cocoa, that's going to be a lot less possible as well, especially for the bulk.
Let me ask that question, because it's something that came up in my conversation with Mark. Is that one of the reasons why this, the difference between is it legal on December 31st and not January 1st has to do with the fact that right now big chocolate companies are looking at Q3 futures markets, right? And what are they going to be doing for next year when cocoa is at an all-time high?
Yeah.
And do they want to invest, again, when we're looking at a short harvest in at least one West African country? I mean, what is that going to do for the price? So are they actually going and committing to very high prices for cocoa that may not be able to be used, right? And, so, this is, this issue. And Mark was talking about, the terminal market, the fact that if we look at New York and London, they actually have physical inventory, and these buffer stocks are used to help reduce some of the volatility which is associated with the price of cocoa, right? What happens, as I think Mark said to me, that there was an example of one of the traders actually buying up a lot of the inventory, physical inventory, in the terminal market rather than paying the living income differential. And so, are we going to are we going to proscribe that kind of behavior, right? And
so
whose responsibility would it be?
So at some point, you're going to also deal with the fact that you cannot make chocolate from digital beans. You're actually going to need the actual beans themselves. And so we've had some really interesting market dynamics over the past couple of years. And you've mentioned two of them: A, the current market, but B, also what happened around the living income differential introduction 2 years ago. And so we've had several moments where it's actually been more interesting for companies to use the cocoa that is in the warehouses. And that means that we're actually also at a phase where there's not a crazy amount of cocoa left in the warehouses to use as a fallback, right? And then at the moment, like last year, we had a slightly lower supply than demand globally. This year, there's going to be a lot less supply than demand, right? I mean, we're looking at
a much bigger shortfall. Yeah,
we're looking at some disastrous harvests, particularly in West Africa. If I hear the stories coming off the field at the moment, just that are coming into my inbox this week and last week from Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, it is absolutely terrifying how bad the harvests are. Like whole parts, like warehouses that are just empty, that are used to be that are supposed to be full in the middle of December, right? We're in the main harvest, we're in the peak of the main harvest, and the warehouses are empty. I mean, I'm not quite sure. I haven't been to the field myself over the past while, so this is all secondhand reporting, but the reporting I'm getting from a variety of sources are terrifying. And so within that context, I don't think that the big traders are going to have a huge amount of luxury of just saying, oh, fine, we'll just grab the beans that are already stored in the EU, because at some point they're going to run out. Right. And so you can play chicken with the Ghanaian and Ivorian government around the lid, because somebody is going to have to give at some point. It's a different game than playing chicken with the EU. That is a monster that you will always lose from, because the EU is the EU and they will win.
Right. So there's been a lot of, in some respects, I go, the situation that you find around the harvest, and this is something that I've seen from a bunch of independent sources. As a matter of fact, I referenced one of them, I believe. It's an industry source, maybe one of the Confectionery News or something like that, who wrote an article about it. Unfortunately, they don't provide primary sources, which
different
bothers
conversation.
Bothers the heck out of me. Primary sources. So what I was going to say about that has just completely slipped my mind in the process of doing that. Perhaps it will. Perhaps it will come. Perhaps it will
So,
come
so maybe
back.
we can then transition to what this means for farmers.
Well, let me ask another question, because
Mhm,
Leo Vogel said yes,
mhm,
we answered his question. Yay, thank you very
mhm,
much. But then he came up with another question, which we really
mhm.
like. Is, do you think EUDR puts pressure on leakage markets such as China and India?
So not for cocoa so much as it would for other commodities, right? I mean, um, the big chocolate companies have spent the last 2 decades and probably hundreds of millions of dollars trying to break the Indian and primarily Chinese markets as consumption markets for cocoa. And the palate there just doesn't seem to appreciate chocolate very much. And so, kind of, even if they do double digit growth numbers in China and in India for decades to come, still, the EU and the US will still be way bigger a market than China and India. So, as a consumption leakage market, not too concerned for cocoa.
Right.
What it will do for coffee, tea, soy, palm oil is might be very different, but is outside of my field of knowledge. So I don't really feel confident to say a lot of things about that. But for chocolate,
Right.
China is a non-relevant consumption block at the
It's,
moment,
yeah, it's
and
such a,
will
it's such a,
be.
right. Well, and again, we're talking about, are the beans going to China for processing and then being exported to the EU?
Doesn't
Right.
matter.
That's in,
Doesn't matter,
it,
because in the end, it still needs to be compliant when it comes into the EU. Now, this is
right.
relevant for the beans in Indonesia, because Indonesia, over the last decade or so, has very much invested in developing a very strong processing industry. And so both Ghana and Ecuador export a lot of their cocoa to Indonesia. Now, most of the cocoa products that Indonesia exports to the United States and Mexico. However, if you're going to make that an in-between stop, then it's going to have to be compliant again. So you can't kind of, oh, fine, we'll just export to Indonesia and then the US and we'll be fine, because in the end, that means that you cannot by any chance import it into Europe after that. And that is different, for example, than when the cadmium regulation, the EU implemented a regulation on maximum threshold levels for cadmium in a bunch of foodstuffs about 7 years ago. And that strongly impacted the cocoa producers in primarily Latin America, because a lot of cocoa grown in Latin America grows on volcanic soil, which naturally has cadmium contents in it. And the way that you could then, and the way that in the end has been avoided, is by mixing high cadmium cocoa with low cadmium cocoa, and then it kind of goes under a certain threshold level that it becomes acceptable to the EU. That is not the case for this
Segue for
deforestation.
my next question. Perfect segue for my next
Mhm,
question.
mhm.
What does this do for mass balance? What does the EUDR do for mass balance in cocoa?
So I don't think you
And
can.
before you do this, if you could explain mass balance for
Yeah.
everyone who may not know what that means.
So mass balance, there's like 3 ways of putting in place traceability for your cocoa. That's mass balance, segregated, and identity preserved. And mass balance basically means that you chuck a bunch of cocoa at the beginning of your supply chain and you say, this is certified or this is for deforestation free. And then you're allowed to take the same amount of tonnage out of the end of the supply chain and say, okay, so we've put 2 kilos of
Fair
deforestation.
trade certified.
Yeah.
Fair
And
trade
at the
certified.
beginning, we can take the same amount out at the end. Now, that's not going to work for this regulation, because if part of it is not deforestation free, the whole batch gets canceled. So basically, it's the end of mass balance into the EU, if you ask me.
Okay, right. Because this is, so when people, so again, right, when you go buy a fair trade certified chocolate bar, look
Mm-hmm,
at it to see if it says mass balance on the back, because it often
mm-hmm,
will. Right. So while I am not generally a big fan of Tony's Chocolate Only
mm-hmm,
and their sourcing practices,
mm-hmm.
what I can say is
Let's
they
do a
are,
podcast about that sometime, Clay, because I think there's a lot of conversation to be had on that. But that's for a different
you
day.
know, I would love to have you back sometime next year to talk about that. But one of the things that I will give Tony's props for is they've been very adamant from the very beginning not to use mass balance
Mm-hmm.
certified.
Yep.
cocoa. All right, so, you know, uh, let's spend the last 15 minutes or so, if we can, Anthony. What does the EUDR mean for the cocoa farmer? And if we can, is there any difference between cocoa farmers in West Africa as opposed to cocoa farmers in any other part of the world? Right. Number one, right?
Just 1 second, Clay. I need to answer that question in a second. I just need to grab something here for someone. Forgive me about
Sure.
this. This is
Not listen. If a cat had crawled through, or the dog, or children, or anything
Yep.
like that, life is what happens while you're busy making plans. You've done
Exactly.
this. It is what it is. So
My
people will know that it actually is happening live.
It is happening completely live. Now, my amazing wife, when she
Yeah.
turned 40, decided that she wanted to learn something new. So she has decided to play the cello. And so she has cello lessons soon. And so she needed the cello case because otherwise it's raining cats and dogs here. So anyway.
So, what does it mean for the farmer? For example, I understand that there is a 4% fine on turnover, right, when it comes to non-compliance.
Yeah.
Does any of that go back to farmers?
No, because the fine isn't made to be a compensation to farmers. So there's really not any grievance mechanism or access to remedy for the farmers. This whole regulation was not designed to protect farmers. This regulation was designed to protect forests, full stop. And so the fines are punitive, not redistributive. And so the fines are there because they don't want to levy a fine. They want to not have deforestation there. And part of the problem is that because the regulation doesn't require a market actor to support whoever needs to comply, it can actually mean that the farmer basically is left with the bill. If you want to still grow cocoa, you're going to have to comply and it's your problem, right? Now, this is where I think, all the way at the beginning of this conversation, I said there's 3 pieces of regulation that are coming through the European pipeline. And the second one on corporate sustainability due diligence, that directive will give us the chance to correct some of the biggest mistakes in the EUDR. I'm a big fan of the EUDR. If it wasn't there, I would be arguing that we needed to get it. But there are some details to it that really could be improved, and we hope they will be improved in a second iteration, because this instrument, like any other complex instrument, will be recalibrated the first few years of its use. And so we do hope that it will get improved over time. But in the meantime, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and they just finished the negotiations around the final text on that last week, literally not even a week ago. And the due diligence directive actually will require companies to ensure farmers have a living income and to review their purchasing practices in order to make sure that farmers have a living income. And that requirement means that companies can't just say to the farmer, oh, you need to comply and we don't care about what that costs, because this new regulation will say, no, look, farmers need to be earning a decent livelihood, and your purchasing practices, Mars, Nestle, Mondelez, Hershey, Ferrero, whoever, your purchasing practices need to be adequate for a farmer to be able to earn that.
So just a real question about that. I mean, we found a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of companies, actors saying, we're just not paying the LID, or we're going to find some way around paying the LID. And so the question is, who decides what's fair when it comes to what a living income is? And then it sounds at this point like, if there are punitive damages, right, there also need to be compensatory damages, right? And I think this is one of the interesting things about what it is that Terry is trying to do with his lawsuits, is that there is not just a punitive damage component, but there is a compensatory damage component. Not sure how those compensatory damages will be distributed, of course, but there is that question. I want to have this conversation, maybe February, March, about Tony's, right? And you can go read everything that I've said about Tony's, and we can have this conversation.
But I think I have actually already read most of it.
And then what I want to do is I want to come back and have this conversation about the corporate sustainability once it's actually inches closer to being adopted, to understand what the the confluence of these two things, how the two of these things are going to work together. And again, I think that one of the things that I'm coming away from here is that there are a bunch of known unknowns. Right? We know that we don't know what they are going to be, so we just need to get this stuff done, right, and figure out where it needs to be changed after the fact. Because if we wait for it to be perfect, it will never get done. And by the time we decide what perfection is, the ground rules will have changed, the circumstances will have changed. And so what are we going to do?
Agreed.
What I want to do is we have from Ferdy van Herden, and I hope that I'm pronouncing that properly, interesting article today about unintended consequences in coffee from Reuters. Coffee firms turning away Africa EU as the deforestation law looms. And you mentioned that when you were talking about Vietnam, like right, people moving away from regimes, right, national regimes, where it might be difficult to, because one of the questions I have is, okay, I'm a farmer and I have, 2 hectares of land. And it turns out that 100 square meters of my plot intersect the deforestation map, right? How do I guarantee compliance at that level? Is my entire farm, right?
So let's make that. How would that have happened? Because that means that farmer has started that farm in the last 3 years, or at least deforested that part of land in the last 3 years, right? So we're not talking about the majority or the plurality of farmers here. That's a small percentage of farmers. I think the bigger challenge is, how do farmers that have been on a farm for the last 15 years, that are therefore not part of the deforestation since 2020, but have struggled to access the tools they need to prove that they've been there 15 years. I think that's the bigger challenge than the ones.
Is this also a land tenure issue? Right. And
obviously, well, I mean,
no. I mean, it's, you involved in it as you have done, right? Understand that is in fact, land tenure is a huge issue. All right. And I don't know that everybody has really thought about this idea that I can prove that I was there prior to this date. Right.
So that's where satellite maps make a difference. So if you've got a satellite photograph that can say, hey, look, this is my plot, this is where I am, you don't even need to be able to prove that you had that land 10 years ago. All you need to do is say, this is my plot right now, and you need to GPS polygon that, right? But GPS polygon mapping is not hard, right? This thing, my smartwatch, GPS polygon maps, my phone, GPS polygon maps. I'm a cyclist.
With sufficient accuracy?
Yeah, basically. I'm a cyclist. My bike computer GPS polygon maps every time I go for a ride, right? We're not talking like really expensive, really complex stuff. If everybody does it, you'll have it. And like, let's say it's not accurate enough, then you would want to have better GPS polygon mapping in the places that are close to protected forests, right? But if you are 20 miles away from the nearest protected forest, then this is more than good enough, right? So
let's talk about, if we can, let's talk about it as a strategy. So for example, I'm going to be in Nigeria in 4 weeks. I'm going to be talking to people there. When we were in London at the International Cocoa and Chocolate Forum, one of the things that Fuad Abubakar Mohammed, who's the president, or the
CMC,
he runs the Ghana Cocoa Marketing Board, which is an extension of Cocoa Bod. Right? He said is that Cocoa Bod has invested in mapping all 800,000 smallholder farms in Ghana. Right, that's what the representation is. I can't speak for the veracity of that representation. I don't have any reason not to believe him. But from a strategy perspective, is that it might be good enough to be able to buy GIS data from the EU or for someplace else, right? And just be able to say, I want, those areas which appear to be deforested. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus my efforts when it comes to farmers on those areas which come like within a kilometer of any place which is on that map, right?
Exactly.
And that's going to be my first priority. Right. And so what we've just done is we've taken the scale of the problem and made it manageable.
basically a risk-based approach. And in the end, that is also what the EUDR looks at. It looks at, you need to approach this from a risk-based perspective, and you need to have done your due diligence. And so basically not every batch will get checked either, right? So they'll check high-risk batches more often than low-risk batches, and that can be per commodity. It can also be per company. So let's say you're a company that has a pretty decent system for traceability in place. The port authorities can then choose to say, fine, we'll check you less than the ones that we don't trust as much. So there is some wiggle space there for kind of being stricter on the. So let's say you've got a student that never does his homework. You will be checking whether he's done his homework every time. If you've got a straight grade A student, you'll check them less often, and port authorities will work on that as well. So it is a bit, as Ferdy here says, that a fundamental issue here in this regulation, it's not aimed at achieving a positive, it's aimed at negating a negative. So it's trying to stop something bad from happening. And so the question around whether or not, how does this help the farmers? It was never designed to do the good thing to help the farmers. That was also not its intent. And I'm also not critiquing it for not achieving that, because that was never its purpose. This is not a sword aimed at an attack. It is a shield aimed at a defense. And so the defense is against deforestation. And this is where you need to look at the regulatory environment as a totality. And so this is where the due diligence directive becomes a very important parallel regulation to the deforestation regulation. And we need this deforestation regulation because of the massive threat that deforestation poses towards, and I don't think I'm putting it dramatically here, but the existence of humankind in the future, right? I mean, the rainforests that we have are rain machines, and they're the ones, there are carbon sinks, there are rain machines, they're everything we need against climate change. And so this is such a key kind of bastion against climate change that we have to maintain this. Yeah.
So I think that again, I want to point out again that from a global perspective, if we think about agriculture being responsible for about 90% of deforestation, right? That cocoa is responsible for about 7.5% of that 90%.
Yeah.
Right. And so in the large scale of things, cocoa is a local contributor, but there are, if I look at commodity or agricultural products which are produced in large quantities, oil palm and soy are going to be larger contributors. However, we can't just say we're going to go after oil palm and soy and just ignore all of these other things. Right? We're going to go after all of them.
And cocoa is not a low contributor. It's in the top 5, right?
Why not sugar? Why not sugar? Is no sugar grown in deforested lands? I would argue that anytime you clear cut to do 1,000 hectares of sugar, you've cut down forest. Maybe not in the last 3 years.
I don't know much about sugar, but I do know that cocoa is not a low contributor because it's a top 5 commodity contribute. It's one of the top 5 commodities in the world driving deforestation, right? That's not low.
Yeah, but so oil palm, soy, timber, and cocoa are 4. Coffee is 5.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the top 5 contributor. But I'm saying that of the top 5, right, it is 7.5% as opposed. So it's roughly 1/5 the contributor of oil palm and 1/4 the contributor. So I'm not saying that it's not a major contributor. It's just, we can. There may be some value of thinking about the relative contribution, right? And maybe not. Maybe okay. I'm looking at you cringe when I say that, and so.
So for me, if we do that at some point, if we turn everything into kind of a relative conversation, then you get a death by 1,000 cuts, right? And
but what I want to do, perhaps suggest as my rationalization for this is the reasoning, is that we don't have a bunch of smallholder oil palm farmers, that these tend to be very, very large clear-cut operations, which are owned by very large corporations. Right? And the same thing is true of soy. These tend to be very, very large monocultures. And as I mentioned earlier, I heard of one in Brazil where it's something like 100,000 hectares of clear-cut soy, right, in the Brazilian rainforest. There's not a whole lot of that in cocoa, right? Just so there is a difference in terms of the actors who are involved in doing this. It might be different if Mars or Mondelez, Berry Callebaut, Cargill, Olam owned 40,000 hectares of farmland and they clear cut everything and they grew the cocoa there. I'm not an apologist for this. I'm not defending it by any stretch of the imagination. I agree that it needs to be done and it needs to. But I'm just wondering, why not sugar, right? I'm gonna research why not sugar in the EUDR. I would be interested.
That's a great question. I'd be interested to know that as well. But if you look at deforestation in the cocoa sector, basically an area the size of the Netherlands was cut down just to grow cocoa over the past decade or two. That is not insignificant. Right?
I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying it is.
No, but if we do that for every commodity and we just say, oh, let's just focus on the top ones, then we're actually not going to make any of the targets that we have as a society. And I think it's an interesting, almost like a not in my backyard argument. I'm not saying that you're doing that, but I do think that we see that in a lot of different places, right? Oh, but what about China on and I think that we need to watch out that we don't. The challenge of deforestation, the challenge of climate is so big that everybody is at bat.
Right. So having been to the Dominican Republic and seen, hundreds of hectares of sugarcane, right? And why not maize? Why not corn?
Good question.
Right? I mean,
I don't know.
So I'm not questioning why cocoa. I'm questioning why not these other things.
Yep.
Right.
And there's a list of commodities. There was a huge discussion, quite a big negotiation around which commodities were and were not going to come into this regulation. And so it wouldn't surprise me if the reason why not sugar is because like the European sugar industry fought hard against that. For example, that's a possibility as well. I don't know, because there's actually a lot of sugar that's grown in the EU through sugar beets rather than sugar cane, right? So
and I'm looking here and I'm saying the only of the top 6, because they're listed here, but the only commodities that are grown in the EU are going to be timber and cattle.
And do you know how hard the fight for timber was? Because do you know, like the Scandinavian countries are massive timber producer countries.
Yeah.
And so generally speaking, when you've got like human rights or environmental regulation discussions within the EU, the biggest cheerleaders for human rights and environmental regulation or interventions in the EU are the Scandic bloc countries, right? They're usually the first to go for this. On this specific one, they were actually some of the hardest to convince because they wanted to maintain their own timber industry.
Right.
Massive, complex conversations.
Right. So if the United States were involved in this conversation, I would say why not sugar is because, if we look at, for example, import duties on chocolate, they're all based upon the quantity of sugar in the chocolate. More sugar, higher import duties to protect the American sugar industry.
Well, interestingly enough, there is an American parallel going on at the moment. Like Senator Schatz just introduced a bipartisan supported new version of the Forest Act just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And that is going to be very interesting to look at as well, because as far as I understand, they're also trying to see how can they align the US-based Forest Act with the EU deforestation regulation, because it would be completely nuts for these multinationals to have 2 completely different kinds of compliances that they have. So they're basically... This is not just going to be an EU thing. There are going to be, the UK is going to implement a deforestation regulation as well at some point as the
because they were so good at negotiating Brexit.
That's a different conversation entirely. And I tend to try to avoid statements around Brexit because that is just a tragedy in far too many parts. And Schadenfreude is not, generally speaking, don't kick a man while he's down. So,
I understand that. I understand that completely. And one of the issues that has come up is about harmonization, because one of
Yep.
the things that we know is that if there are difference in regulatory regimes,
Hmm.
that people will gain the differences to their advantage
Exactly.
for as long as they are allowed to. And
Hmm.
so harmonization of the EUDR regulations around the world. Right. So to some extent, this has been done on food. If I think about, we have the FDA regulations around chocolate and CFR 21,
Hmm.
about 163, but then we have the Codex Alimentarius and most of the rest
Yep.
of the world, right? And there are some differences between the U.S. rules and the rules in the Codex Alimentarius, but they
Hmm.
but they tend to be fairly few. And the major ones have to do with non-cocoa butter fats and whether or not
I
you
was
can
about to
label.
say the biggest
Yeah.
problem is can you put
Well, the
non-cocoa
biggest
butter fats in?
difference, is it a problem? I don't know, but it is right. I mean, we can argue both sides of that equation. By the way, I
Yeah.
agree with you. And it's one of the reasons why, Cadbury products tend to be manufactured under license by Hershey in the United States. And some Nestle products are manufactured by license because it turns out they're two separate ingredients because of the regulations around what can be in chocolate in the United States, right? And other things. Yeah.
And in fact, I recently heard heard of the fact that the non-cocoa butter equivalent stuff that you put in your chocolate in the US has got
Mhm.
the same chemical substance that vomit does, which is why for non-Americans,
Mhm.
chocolate made in the US tastes
Right.
like vomit.
Well, it's actually very, very specific just to Hershey, by the way. It's not across the board. Okay. And the
Yep.
reason, and it actually goes back to the fact that when Hershey sold his caramel business, right,
Hmm.
around the Chicago Exposition in 1893 and bought all the German chocolate making equipment to ship
Hmm.
back to Hershey. So he sold the caramel business to finance the purchase of the
Hmm.
chocolate equipment. He
Hmm.
went to Switzerland, right, and
Hmm.
said, "Hey, Henri Nestle, can I license your powdered milk patent so I can make milk chocolate using your powdered milk?" And Hershey said, "No, I have this existing contract with Daniel Peter,
Hmm.
right? And so I'm not going to license you my patent." So Hershey went to the UK. He learned how to make chocolate crumb
Hmm.
from Cadbury and Fry, came back to the United States, started making chocolate crumb,
Hmm.
Pennsylvania and milk. And what happens is he wasn't careful, and the milk went sour during the process of condensing it, right? And that is the source of the butyric acid, which gives Hershey's milk chocolate its off flavor. But it is limited to Hershey's milk chocolate, and it goes back to an industrial mistake, which is now more than 125 years old, right? It has nothing
Hands
to
from
do
the
with
grave.
we're not deliberately adding butyric acid. Now, that's not quite true. When Scharfenberger, I actually had a conversation with John about this. When
Hmm.
Scharfenberger chocolate maker was
Hmm.
in the process of negotiating the sale, they were saying, okay, we want to sell the business. So by that
Hmm.
time, Robert Steinberg had passed away. They had never made a milk chocolate, but they
Hmm.
searched, John told me, for a long time to find a milk product that would imitate to some extent the flavor of Hershey's milk chocolate so that
Yep.
Scharfenberger tasted like an adult version
Hmm.
of what people grew up with Hershey's milk chocolate. And so it became sort of a natural, we may cannibalize our audience, but we're going to move them up to a more expensive premium product, right? And we did that by all of the Hershey guys going, "Wow, I love the way this tastes," because they're used to tasting their own milk chocolate. Anyway,
That's
it's
that's that's a fascinating sidetrack. How did we get here?
well, so one of the ways is when you think about answering questions around cocoa and chocolate, the answer is always it depends. So it depends. So
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
and you and I come from a background of high technology. And so, for example, one might argue the question when we think about the shape of old style television sets,
Hmm.
which is the aspect ratio of 4:3,
Yep.
right? Why did they decide on 4:3?
Hmm.
Right? Is because when they were inventing television, they said, "Oh God, we're going to record." Well, they probably didn't say, "Oh God," they said, "Oh my, we're going to need a source of content." And it
Hmm.
turns out that the shape of 16 millimeter film was 4:3. So they could create a telecine and then just right be able to literally broadcast the film playing live. And so that's why the shape of television is 4:3. Right. So Sony, when they originally put together, HDTV,
Hmm.
technology. They took the technology of slow motion and said, we can expand bandwidth in one dimension, time. Why don't we change that expanded and add it to the physical dimension? That's where it came. That's where the technology for HDTV came out of slow motion. But why they, but Sony said 15:9, right? That's the aspect ratio, right? But why did they choose 16:9? Right. And then I have one more example that I'll change from another. And 16:9 is one 4:3 image with three 4:3 images outside picture, out of picture. So if you had a set which had 4 tuners, you could be watching 4 channels simultaneously, right? With no black bars, with no letterboxing anywhere.
And so I'm going to add one more detail here as a Dutch guy. So do you know why the hole at the center of a CD has the exact size of the center of the CD is the exact circumference of the Dutch 10-cent coin that we had until the euro got introduced? Because the two guys that were developing the CD at Philips in the Netherlands, they're like, how big should we make the hole? And this guy had this 10-cent coin in his pocket, and he's like, let's use this. And actually, also the reason why CDs are 74 minutes is because that's the exact length.
That's what I was going to mention.
Of the favorite classical piece of music by the guy at Sony, I think.
You take the longest piece of music, right, and that you want to be able to put without having to interrupt the music, right, and change discs.
Exactly.
So
but
it's a fed. Well, but and again, I want to talk about fairity. It's unintended consequences. Right, which is this interesting thing. It's the unknown unknowns. We do this thing, and we haven't been able to. So these things are all, just closely interlinked with each other, and having the conversations around this so that we have a better understanding of what the consideration is. Oh, how many people who are thinking about the EUDR who are in the cocoa and chocolate industry did not know that the purpose of this had nothing to do with helping farmers, right? And that's an important, and now all of a sudden, the entire conversation becomes a real different conversation. So how many people who know about the EUR didn't know about, this overlap with the corporate social responsibility regulation, which is coming up behind it, and what the impact is going to be. So I think that this is why giving ourselves the permission to be able to make these detours, right, and understanding, Hershey's milk chocolate tastes the way it does in 2023 because of an industrial manufacturing accident in the 1890s, right, is a fabulous, and I can go on and tell you why the resolution of 1920 by 1080. I can tell you exactly. I won't do that today, but I know why. I worked for the first high definition television production company in North America in 1991, 92. So I was there before HDTV, in the process of HDTV being adopted in the United States. So I got some sensibility. So Anthony, number one, I want to say thank you to everybody who's been watching. We run a little long. Anthony, I want to say thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. It's been too long since we've seen each other in person. I may be in Amsterdam in February for Chocoa. I'm not sure yet if that's going to happen. Would love to, but would love to sit down over hot chocolate and talk about these things. I definitely want to have this conversation about Tony's and have conversation about the corporate social responsibility regulations that are going to be coming up in the future. And I want to close out by saying thank you to everybody. You've been watching Pod Save Chocolate. And I want to again say that if you're watching here and you're not a member of the Chocolate Life, go over to thechocolatelife.com. This is the homepage right now. I'm logged into my account, which is why it says account up here. But if you go in, it'll say join. There's always been a free membership. You can support what is we're doing. Obviously, there are a lot of demands on everybody's pocketbook. At this time and at this time of year. But if you can support what it is that I'm doing to keep these things on the air, I do appreciate every bit of support that you can give. I do want to say also to everyone that this coming Friday's episode is going to be the last episode of the year, I think. I'm going to be talking about 2023 in review, looking forward to 2024. I'm traveling for the holidays. I'm not going to be back until the 29th or 30th And so I'm going to take the last week off and be with family. But until then, again, Anthony, very much thank you. And to everyone, right, remember, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun,